I'm Karen Rommelfanger, and I'm thrilled to open this session of our keynote with Dr. Tim Brown. Dr. Tim Brown is currently a postdoctoral research associate working primarily on an NIH-funded project on the effect of Neuro Technologies on user agency. He's also a longtime contributor to the Center for Neuro Technology at University of Washington, Seattle's Neuroethics Thrust, where he supports efforts to teach neuroethics to young investigators, catalyze ethics investigations through interdisciplinary collaboration, and promote the field of neuroethics through public outreach. He's been an embedded researcher in UW's biorobotics lab with a diverse group of engineers and scientists engineering the next generation of human-machine interactive technologies. More generally, Dr. Brown work lies at the intersection of biomedical ethics, philosophy, and technology, and Black, Latinx, queer feminism, and aesthetics. He was recently appointed chair of the International Neuroethics Society's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, and today he'll be discussing findings from his recently completed series of MacArthur-funded workshops on the social impact of brain-machine interfaces. His title today is The Social Impact of Brain-Machine Interfaces, Structural Inequalities in Brain-Machine Interface Study and Practice. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown.
Thank you for the excellent introduction. Hello, everybody out there. I wish I could see your faces, but circumstances are the way they are, and we're learning to live with them. But yeah, today I'm going to speak a little bit about the series of, as Karen mentioned, MacArthur Foundation funded workshops that we put on over the summer. I'm calling this Social Justice and Brain-Computer Interfaces, Mapping the Terrain. And that's exactly what we'll do. We're going to think a little bit about how social justice and neurotechnology are intersect with one another, and how we can anticipate some of the social justice challenges faced by technologists, clinicians, and humanists working on brain-machine interfaces and brain-computer interfaces. So let's set an agenda. I'll say a little bit more about who I am, but I didn't expect Karen's introduction of me to be so extensive. So I'll move quickly past this. We'll talk about those intersections I mentioned a second ago between social justice and neurotechnology, starting from the more general and moving into the more specific. We'll talk about the structure of the MacArthur-funded workshops, and we'll look at themes and lessons from each of these workshops. And then we'll end with a few general observations. And I also should say at the outset that I want there to be as much time for questions and answers as possible. So I'm going to try to move through this material fairly quickly, but I have a tendency to ramble. So I'm going to do the best I can and leave as much room at the end as possible. So who am I? I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Washington. Yes, I work on an NIH-funded grant that works on working on a project investigating the impact of brain-computer interfaces on user agency. We have a pretty weird and robust concept or notion of agency we can talk about offline, but we're thinking about neurotechnologies from the perspective of identity, privacy, authenticity, trust. Trust is going to be the big one for this session. I do use Black, Latinx, and queer feminist tools to investigate user experiences of neurotechnology, and that will also be pretty important to today's session. I worked in a center for neurotechnology. This used to be an NSF-funded center, but we've run to the end of our NSF funding. And now it's an interesting mix of governmental support, industry support, and internal university supported research. it's turned into a very interesting place to be and do research, especially from the perspective of social justice. We can talk about that later. Um, and I think that's enough about me. So let's start. Let's start at a pretty high level. So neurotechnologies are presented as a means of transforming medical practice and interpersonal life. On the left here, we have the BrainGate project, which is use of highly invasive um, neurotechnologies to give people with spinal cord injuries and other kinds of injuries a means of controlling robotic limbs, computers, so on and so forth. This is a system that was, when it was introduced, a very robust system, but nowadays we want even more robust systems. On the right, we have Neuralink, which is a company started by Elon Musk, which purports to give us simultaneous stimulation and recording electrodes with very high bandwidth and resolution in a very sleek package. And so we have these sorts of companies. These are not uncommon companies these days. We have companies like Kernel, Neuralink. We also have companies like Facebook getting into brain-computer interfaces. Facebook recently announced that uh, they are working on an optical brain-computer interface that they're going to try to use for virtual reality, augmented reality applications, probably social media applications, because that's who they are. Um, and so these technologies are being pitched as a means of transforming how we practice medicine. Um, and so it's not entirely clear what the application of a device like these are. Well, right now we have certain disease modalities in mind. So things like spinal cord injury um, in the case of BrainGate, but for Neuralink, we're not actually sure what they're going to use that system for. It's being presented as a platform. Um, but we know that these technologies can be the technologies that we rely on for brain-computer interfaces um, are built on foundational technologies that have the potential to enact um, racism, sexism, ableism. Um, and so on the left, we can see Joy Boulamwini's Gender Shades project, where they ran pretty rigorous tests on facial recognition algorithms to see how good they were at detecting different kinds of faces, um, faces of people with different genders, different skin tones, and so on. And we can see that um, women who have darker complexions have a higher chance of being misrecognized. Joy Boulamwini went on to do a project called AI Ain't I a Woman that interrogated this specific form of sexism that is embedded in facial recognition algorithms by taking famous Black women, pictures of famous Black women, and running them through facial recognition algorithms. Most of them were identified as men. And so this is a big difficulty. Um, Neurotechnologies these days are being transformed into simple systems that read neural activity and make decisions based on it, into technologies that make use of machine learning algorithms that that make decisions on the user's behalf, that classify and um, that analyze and classify data. Um, and the facial recognition algorithms are just one specific case study of how these things have gone wrong. Microsoft released or demoed a natural language processing algorithm that responds to tweets on Twitter. Um, and it was named Tay, Tay Tweets. Um, and this system went very quickly from being a very positive, um, interactive system on Twitter to being um, pretty much an oppressive force on Twitter. This system learned from the users surrounding it how to be racist, how to be sexist. Um, and they subsequently took it down. But this is not the only place that we've seen these kinds of outcomes, of course. And people are using natural language processing algorithms to do all kinds of work. Facebook is investigating the possibility of using algorithms like these to identify people who are depressed and get them help quickly. But would you want a system like this um, figuring out if you were depressed? I don't think so. Um, and these foundational technologies are developed within and through institutions that have ongoing histories of violence against marginalized people. On the left, you can see a photo taken during the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where Black men were asked to participate in an ongoing longitudinal study of how syphilis affects the body. Back when they didn't really know how syphilis affected the body or if Black people were more susceptible to it. The researchers involved with this study were of the mind that they were doing a service to the Black community by dispelling the myth that they were recipient more likely to get the disease because of their own neglect, their own inability to be hygienic, or because of some genetic or physiological predisposition to the disease. And so they infected these men with syphilis and denied them certain kinds of care and also gave them certain kinds of care. And eventually that study turned into one where they were essentially allowing them to die so that the researchers could see their cadavers, to see how syphilis kills. And this is very difficult. And to this day, there are some people who don't think anything was wrong with this study. On the right, you have Henrietta Lacks, who famously um, was diagnosed with cancer. Her cells were harvested, cultured in a lab for study. That study never really led to a treatment for her, and she died. But her cells were the first immortalized line of cells. They found that her cells would reproduce eternally in the right conditions. And so to this day, Henrietta Lacks's cells are used for all manners of experiments. They're her cells, they replicate immortally. But her family was not informed of this, and there were religious, spiritual implications. This is a big difficulty. Um, and and so there's a certain kind of financial disenfranchisement that happened in Henrietta Lacks's case. Her body was used in a way that she didn't authorize, and her family was not compensated for, and a certain justice was not done. And so while some neuroethicists consider the social justice challenges of neurotechnology, it's not a common topic. We generally think about the social justice challenges of neurotechnologies in I wouldn't say a narrow context, um, but you mostly see it in the context of the potential for enhancement technologies. So the possibility that enhancement technologies won't be distributed justly, that enhancement technologies will identify some people as deficient when they aren't deficient, um, and whether or not certain technologies are beneficial to people with disabilities. We've seen a fair bit of that kind of analysis, in particular when it comes to the use of things like cochlear implants by communities like no, by communities with disabilities, so the deaf community. Um, but it would be useful to neuroethics more broadly if we could gather the key players in this space so that we're not just doing disparate work, few and far between. Um, if we could identify the core social justice problems within neuroscience and neuroengineering, and we could provide a guide for future explorations. We would like more work to be done. While we do appreciate all of the work that has been done, we would like more work to be done. And it seems like these are just the things that we need to do to spur that work. So me and my colleagues, we put together 3 virtual workshops on the social impact of brain-machine interfaces. These were funded by the MacArthur Foundation. Um, my my collaborator on this project is Ryan Kalo of University of Washington School of Law. He is the director of the Tech Policy Lab. And I, of course, represent the Center for Neuro Technology, and we received support from both in this project. We were very thankful for that. We decided to do a series of 3 workshops because COVID-19. We had originally planned to do a half-day conference, but instead these virtual workshops turned out to be likely a better option. We were able to have 3 of them instead of 1 of them, but we were also able to cover a wider array of topics. And the topics we covered were bias and big brain data, right? So recognizing the impact of bias on big data that's collected from neural implants, so invasive neural recordings that produce tons of data. Even in one patient, you get whole hard drives full of data. Um, Structural inequality in brain-machine interface practice, um, and value-sensitive design and neurotechnology. So we were able to think about these 3 topics on 3 separate days, and I think it turned out very well. So let's look at the first topic, bias and big brain data. For this session, we had 3 folks joining us. We had Jillian Hugh and Karen Rommelfanger from Emory. And hello, Karen. Hi, Karen. And Laura Specker-Sullivan, who is now at Fordham University. And this was a very lively session, and it was a great way to kick off this series of workshops. We found that the perspectives of researchers, technologists, and clinicians shape how neural data is collected, stored, analyzed, and acted upon. And so I think a lot of us who work in laboratories, and me having been a humanist embedded in a laboratory, I've seen this firsthand. The way that devices are developed or experiments are designed directly reflects the values of the researchers designing them. We would like to think that this is an aperspectival process whereby some objective group of people comes up with some objective means of ascertaining some kind of knowledge. But knowledge production is deeply perspectival. And some of the shapes that that some of the ways that neural data is collected, stored, analyzed, acted upon, disenfranchise, marginalize, or even oppress whole groups. And I say ontologically oppress because it really does matter how neural data is collected, how it's stored, and what we analyze from it, and how we analyze it. When we do these things to data, we determine the categories of the data that we collect. We decide what's salient, what isn't, what categories can be applied to the data, what techniques ought to be used on the data to make it useful for a specific purpose. In other words, we make an ontology. We determine what exists. That's what ontos means. Ontology is, the root is ontos, and ontos means being. So we determine what being there is in the data and what it corresponds to. And this can marginalize people, right? Imagine, for example, our use of neural data to determine gender. Many studies are ongoing to figure out if we can detect gender using neural data alone. Just as controversially, can we use neural data to identify when someone's lying? Or even to identify that a person is who they say they are? Can we use neural data to determine a brain fingerprint? I think biological explanations of social phenomena are especially worrisome because these can encode harmful assumptions about marginalized people. This is Karen Rommelfanger's, these are Karen Rommelfanger's words in this session, and I think they're especially impactful. Yeah. But we also have to remember that biases are not necessarily harmful. We all have perspectives, yeah? And we just need to acknowledge and interrogate them. So why do we have the perspectives we do? Why do we have the background assumptions we do? Why do we have the beliefs we do? If we acknowledge our perspectives and interrogate those perspectives, we can better understand how they're impacting the way the data that we collect is being used. Neuroscience, tech, and ethics is cross, inter, and transdisciplinary. And this is a huge strength of our fields. In other words, to solve neuroscientific and neurotechnological problems, and neuroethical ones, if we're being honest, we have to think together across many, many disciplinary boundaries. We can't just be neuroscientists. We can't be just computational neuroscientists, and we can't be electrical engineers. We can't just be philosophers or anthropologists or historians. We have to try to understand many perspectives at once. And this is a strength because it gives us the ability to question our perspectives more so than if we were just a homogenous group of researchers or people working in a very, very narrow field. But we still have to embrace and incorporate more perspectives into neuroscientific practice because STEM is largely white and male, because humanities are largely white and male. We have to embrace more perspectives. In other words, we have to decolonize neuroethics, right? And so that means, doing more critical racial theory, doing more feminist work, thinking more about queer perspectives within our field, trying to bring those perspectives to bear on how the technology works. The second session was called Structural Inequality and BMI. So what do we mean by structural inequality? A lot of people are asking that these days, especially with COVID, disrupting our institutions, putting them on display, to be honest. Inequalities are structural when they are built into and configure the institutions and systems we inhabit. So instead of thinking about individuals and how they produce inequalities, right? Each person going, well, I prefer this person over that person. We can see the inequalities in the principles, goals, policies, and mechanisms of institutions. So which projects get funded? Who evaluates these applications for the projects? Who wrote the call for applications? These are the kinds of questions we could ask about grant giving organizations. But we could also ask the same questions about who gets into graduate school in neuroscience. We can ask the same questions about what kinds of programs were made available to high school students. We could ask the same things about requirements for ethics review. What things are required? What kinds of things aren't? And these are built into the institutions themselves. Karen, on the first day of our sessions, had a great turn of phrase, or used a great turn of phrase. We have to ask who is at the table versus who is on the table. And that's just calling our attention to the fact that sometimes the community of researchers doesn't at all resemble the people who are participating in human subjects research. And sometimes marginalized people aren't in either of those groups. They are neither on the table or at the table. And that's an unfortunate circumstance or unfortunate outcome. So we have to interrogate all of these systems and reconfigure them so that marginalized people get a seat at the table, receive uptake when they speak, are able to be the recipients of the technologies that are produced by companies and laboratories, and are neither targeted nor ignored by resulted technologies. Having a seat at the table, we know that that's important because, you know, technologies get developed without input from the communities that are going to be impacted by them. Uptake is especially important. A lot of times justice can be done by recognizing that a group of people exists in the first place. But also it's done when we listen to and act upon their words when they speak up. And of course, you know, distributive justice concerns are always going to be concerns. I once had a high school student, my first high school mentee, who's deeply worried that he and his community wouldn't be the recipients of the technologies that he was working on in his laboratory. And there was nothing that I could tell him that would make him feel better because I knew he was right. It's unfortunate. And of course, we saw earlier with artificially intelligent systems that we can be targeted by those systems as recipients for whatever kinds of harmful interactions we're used to. So we can be targeted for sexism, for racism, or we could be ignored by those technologies altogether, and that is often just as infuriating. Imagine a system that is meant to treat mental health conditions, but doesn't recognize your particular mode of emotions because it's trained on a model of white emotions. This could be very difficult. And the last session was on value-sensitive design and neurotechnology. And we asked a number of questions. We asked which values shape neurotechnology, whose values shape neurotechnology. Should we care about normalcy, health, flourishing, restoration, enhancement? But this is also reciprocal. Not only do we have values that shape neurotechnology, neurotechnology shapes our values. So how does it do that, right? So, and these are questions that we don't quite know the answers to. This technology is new. We don't know how neurotechnologies will change our values. We certainly do know that, with things like, with transhumanism, the idea that at some point we will transcend humanity, or our current form as humans, embrace technology in ways that completely transform us. We see a certain kind of aperspectival, value-free, or at least certain values are left missing from that picture. To the point where we, Black people, have to say there are Black people in the future, and we have to assert that we will still be around, that somehow our racial identities will not be transcended once we transcend humanity. So we're already starting to see some movement there. Are human values universal? Are they bound to specific cultures and contexts? And we had a lively debate about this. We didn't really come to any deep conclusions, but it doesn't seem to be the case that we can just take it for granted that values like health are universal. The values adopted by technologists should reflect the values of the users of those technologies. And that means that we have to really take a closer look at who is using the technologies. And disabled people are particularly vulnerable. Typically, we think of certain neurotechnologies that are meant for restoration of function as beneficial, where some people with disabilities don't want just a simple return to normal. They want to be who they are, but they also want to be able to move through the world that is largely ableist and largely discouraging of their existence in it. So technologists should consider values in design by working closely with communities of potential end users to identify what values are important to them. And of course, as we said earlier, we should expand the number of communities that we engage with. We should develop working definitions of values. So we should be very clear about what those values are. And we should figure out what requirements designs should have to uphold those values. So if we're thinking about, a device that promotes well-being, we need to know what well-being is, and we need to know how well-being is exhibited or not exhibited by a device that we've designed. We need to identify how the device can be designed in a way that upholds those values. So we need to come up with design plans that fit the requirements that conform to the definitions we specified, that line up with the values of the communities that we, sounds like a Rube Goldberg, but this is how it has to be. We also have to remember that infrastructures themselves are also technologies. They also should reflect the values of the people who interact with them. So, a few closing remarks. Throughout all of our sessions, this work was difficult, to say the least. Structural inequalities, if we're talking in terms of structural inequalities, I mean, are so deeply embedded in those structures, or those structures are so deeply embedded in our institutions that uncovering them can feel like excavation. And so we have to dig around to find the cornerstone of structural inequality. And then we have to uncover the entirety of that structure to just make headway on achieving justice for marginalized people. And doing that can feel like you're unraveling something, unraveling the sweater that you're wearing right now. And that's really difficult. If you're unraveling the clothes that you're wearing, you'll soon be naked, right? Yeah, I'm having a Weezer moment right now. And so addressing social justice challenges can feel daunting, precisely because it seems like to make very little headway, you have to address an entire pipeline of issues. But these are social problems, and social problems have social solutions, and we can't take them on ourselves. We have to reach out to communities who've been doing this work forever. We have to reach out to other academics who've been doing this work forever. And so, again, our diversity as a collection of fields is a strength. Neuroethics is a deeply interdisciplinary field, and it should be even more interdisciplinary so that we don't feel like we're doing it on our own. And that's it.
Wonderful. That is what's a really moving and spectacular summary of some very complicated landscapes in neuroscience, neuroethics, and our world. So fantastic. And naturally, we have some good questions that have come from that as well. I want to remind our viewers that we'll also have, following this, a discussion of a neuroethics framework that is being piloted, which will also weave in some of these thoughts too. So let me get started here with the first, Tim, which is one that is long, and let me get the main point out of it. It's that a question by Ilana Jones, that data collection is already used to highly target people to generate economic demands for products. And they're talking about BMI coupled with other automation technologies have the potential to revolutionize our economy, our evaluation of human labor, and potentially our evaluation of human value. So given that technology neural landscape, how is that going to, she wants to know, how is that going to impact humanity, and what will be the role of brain-machine interfaces in ushering in the fourth industrial revolution?
So the problem
Oof.
is we don't know. We have
Yeah.
no idea. And in some ways that's because we're determining it as we go. We have some inkling of how things are going to develop. So of course we're thinking about, the increasing the economic demand for products. Definitely we're thinking of that. And so the first thing I think of when I hear about Facebook developing a brain computer interface is that they're going to use it to figure out what we want, and give us more advertisements. Um, and of course, the group developing these brain computer interfaces are the Facebook Reality Labs, which has already put out. Well, Facebook Reality Labs bought Oculus, which was a virtual reality headset company, essentially. And they put out their first virtual reality headset as Facebook Reality Labs. It's a standalone device, and there's a catch. While it's an entirely amazing experience to use, you need a Facebook account to use it, which means that, whatever games you play are going to be linked in with the stuff you click like on, and your reactions to things. And of course, this has to have the long end game of, being, linked to the sales of products. And in fact, Facebook's product is our data. That's the product that they sell to their corporate partners. And so, um, how will BMI or BCI be used to usher in this fourth industrial revolution? it seems like it'll proceed the way it did before, by, creating banks of our neural data to be analyzed and categorized in ways that are beneficial to advertisers. I think advertising is the one of the big threats, and we have to really look out for it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that thoughtful question and that thoughtful answer. Next question is Kelvin Jones asking about funding. At the funding level, would you advocate for end user engagement at the outset of neurotech development, i.e. low ranking for neurotech projects that do not include a representative steering group of end users? Okay, so this is about rating a grant and offering funding and the rubric around that.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a tendency for people working on neurotechnologies to say that their work is basic scientific research. I think that we should incorporate some engagement with end user communities or potential end user communities into the rubric for these for funding, and also ethics review required by funding. I think it's to do anything else is a disservice. I know that it's sort of inevitable that if we ask for that kind of engagement, we'll get half attempts at engaging with communities of end users. But I think that if we figure out ways to evaluate the rigor and depth of those engagements with end users, it would almost certainly be a great thing.
Related to that, I was thinking, Tim, about your talk and how you're saying we need to identify and get the key players in the space to participate.
Yes.
Which and this is, I'm thinking in this context, it's grants, but who do you think is typically at the table? Who's really missing in this conversation?
So in the projects that I've worked on, we typically do some reconnaissance without the community in mind at the table at all. We end up, just speculating on who would be impacted and who wouldn't be impacted. And as a high-level NSF-funded center, one of our, or rather a thrust of a high-level effort to incorporate neuroethics into a NSF-funded center, one of our big tasks was figuring out how to reach out to specific communities. And I can say pretty certainly that, outside of the occasional focus group, that a lot of people are just not reaching out to communities of color, and not reaching out to people with disabilities until it's time to test the device, when they're recruiting for a study. But so in some ways, it's a matter of when aren't people included. So there's a temporal aspect to this. But generally, a lot of studies operate in a vacuum. There are lots of groups that are trying nowadays to bring more groups in, but by and large, the people at the table are, academics, device companies, and not even all the time neuroethics, not even neuroethicists.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another really interesting question by Louis Li Wei Chong. Could you provide a salient example of how a given mental concept that we currently assume to be universal, like attention memory, could be selective for predominant cultural norms? And if how, BMIs that seek to regress from these concepts could result in biased or discriminatory sequences?
Okay, so this is interesting. So I would think health, just flat out health, as a value is considered a universal value. We generally think that, you know, the technologies that are produced by universities and medical device manufacturers are meant to improve the well-being of patients through some intervention. And that intervention is usually, I mean, even if it's not the best experience, if it leads to well-being, then it's worth it. A lot of times that's not the case. So I think one famous example is the, you know, the use of cochlear implants in the deaf community. The deaf community has a live and vibrant uh, culture and a distinct linguistic tradition of sign language. And parents of deaf children are worried that their children, if they use cochlear implants, then they'll be stuck between worlds. They won't be fully included in hearing communities and they won't be fully included in deaf communities. And so the values there, you know, are often contested. If a person wants to have a deaf kid and chooses to allow them to remain deaf, a lot of people are critical of that decision. They say that the value of health and restoration should take precedence over whatever cultural worries you have about their ability to fit in. And that's really difficult. But in brain-machine interfaces, I can see the beginnings of similar controversies. So using deep brain stimulation for things like Alzheimer's, right? We typically think of Alzheimer's as a bad thing, just generally a bad thing. We want to make sure that people keep their memories as long as possible. And I think that was mentioned in the question. I think that was one of the. But this idea that we should keep our functions at whatever cost possible, even if they produce stigmas about people with Alzheimer's, even if they participate in those stigmas, even if it leads to worse outcomes for the person because they're trying so hard to maintain these memories on their own instead of relying on their communities to help them remember things or just allow them not to remember things and just make them happy. These things can be in tension, and I can see that being an obstacle for brain-computer interfaces related to Alzheimer's in the future.
Great. And I think I'm just going to have this one last question because it leads nicely into the next session. We'll have a break after this question and then go into, we'll continue to answer a lot of these great questions in the chat in that session too. The question is, what can we as civil actors do to try to get ahead of abuse of BMI technology and usher in policy that will protect human rights?
Oh, this is a big question. So one great thing, yeah, this is a good segue into the next session. We can introduce frameworks that give everybody who, all the stakeholders, I worry about that word, stakeholder, that term, because a lot of stakeholders don't hold stakes. It's kind of a strange thing. But yeah, certainly to stave off the potential abuse of BMI, we have to propose guidelines for research, models of ethics engagement, whether that be embedding humanists in laboratories or leading discussions with them or consulting with them. I think all of these things are important. We have to do that. Driving policy to regulate technologies that are already in the wild. Medical device companies have plenty of regulations on them, but what about startups? What about companies like Facebook, Amazon, so on and so forth? And I think we have to shine a light on the darker places in BMI research. People are moving toward cloud computing platforms and cloud storage platforms that are going to handle all of the neural data that we produce in the next 10 years. So that means that Amazon and Google are going to have that data and make programming interfaces to interact with that data. What kind of monopoly is that going to give them over neural data? What are they going to want to do with it? Are they going to want a piece of that action? So we need to think about regulation. We need to think about policy, and we need to do it now.